What if I told you that a man in the Bible didn't die, but instead was taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot? It sounds like something out of a fantasy movie, but this incredible event actually happened to the prophet Elijah. In this video, we're going to explore the extraordinary life of Elijah, from his courageous stand against 450 false prophets to his miraculous ascension into heaven. You'll discover how this ordinary man became one of the most powerful prophets in history, and what his story can teach us about faith, courage, and God's incredible power. Elijah burst onto the scene in ancient Israel during a time of spiritual darkness. The nation had strayed far from the worship of the one true God, instead embracing the pagan deities of neighboring cultures. Into this fractured spiritual landscape stepped Elijah, a prophet from the rugged region of Gilead, east of the Jordan River. We know little about Elijah's early life or how he was called to be a prophet. The Bible introduces him simply as Elijah the Tishbite, suggesting he came from a town called Tishbe. What we do know is that Elijah arrived with a burning passion for the God of Israel and a fierce determination to turn his people back from idolatry. The contrast between Elijah's unwavering faith and the widespread idol worship in Israel was stark. While the majority of Israelites had abandoned their covenant with God in favor of Baal worship, Elijah stood firm. He understood that this spiritual adultery would have dire consequences for the nation if left unchecked. Elijah's first recorded act was a bold confrontation with the infamous King Ahab. This ruler had led Israel deeper into paganism than any before him, even erecting a temple to Baal in the capital of Samaria. Standing before the king, Elijah declared, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." This prophecy of drought was more than just a prediction of bad weather. It was a direct challenge to Baal, who was believed to control rain and fertility. By pronouncing a drought, Elijah was setting the stage for a showdown between the true God of Israel and the false god Baal. The significance of this prophecy cannot be overstated. In an agrarian society, years without rain meant certain famine and economic collapse. Elijah was essentially announcing God's judgment on the nation for their idolatry. It was a wake-up call designed to shock Israel back to their senses and turn their hearts back to the Lord. As the drought took hold, God provided for Elijah in a remarkable way. He was instructed to hide by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan. There, ravens brought him bread and meat twice daily, and he drank from the brook. This divine provision demonstrated God's faithfulness to those who serve him, even in the midst of widespread judgment. However, as the drought intensified, even the brook Cherith eventually dried up. This set the stage for Elijah's next divine appointment, an encounter with a widow in the foreign land of Zarephath. God was about to use Elijah to perform a miracle that would not only sustain him, but also bring hope to an unlikely ally in a pagan territory. As Elijah set out for Zarephath, he had no idea of the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. His faith would be tested, his courage challenged, and his prophetic calling affirmed in ways he could never have imagined. The stage was set for a series of dramatic encounters that would shape not only Elijah's life, but the spiritual destiny of an entire nation. Elijah's journey led him to the unlikeliest of saviors, a starving widow on the brink of despair. But in the depths of famine, could emptiness become the very vessel for a miracle? The events about to unfold in Zarephath would redefine the meaning of sacrifice and reveal the extraordinary power of obedience in the face of impossible odds. As Elijah approached the gates of Zarephath, a foreign city beyond Israel's borders, he encountered a widow gathering sticks. The scene before him was one of utter desolation. The drought that had ravaged Israel had reached far beyond its boundaries, leaving this Gentile town in the grip of famine. The widow, her gaunt frame a testament to prolonged hunger, was preparing for what she believed would be her final meal. Elijah, guided by divine instruction, made an audacious request. He asked this stranger, clearly at the end of her resources, for water and bread. The widow's response revealed the depth of her desperation. She had only a handful of flour and a little oil left, barely enough for one last meal for herself and her son. After that, death by starvation seemed inevitable. Yet Elijah persisted, challenging the widow to an extraordinary act of faith. He instructed her to first make a small loaf for him, promising that if she did so, her flour and oil would not run out until the drought ended. This request pushed the boundaries of ancient Near Eastern hospitality customs, which held providing for guests as a sacred duty. Even so, the widow faced an agonizing choice: use the last of her food for a stranger, or save it for her family's final meal. In a remarkable display of trust, the widow chose to obey. She took her meager supplies and prepared food for Elijah, stepping out in faith despite the seeming impossibility of the situation. What followed was nothing short of miraculous. Day after day, meal after meal, the flour jar did not empty, and the oil jug did not run dry. This continuous provision stood as a powerful testament to God's faithfulness and his ability to sustain life even in the harshest circumstances. The miracle of the flour and oil transformed the widow's household. Where once there had been only the prospect of death, now there was sustenance and hope. Elijah remained with the widow and her son, and for a time it seemed that they had found a haven of peace amidst the turmoil of drought and famine. However, this period of relative stability was not to last. A new crisis loomed on the horizon, one that would shake the foundations of faith even more profoundly than the previous miracle. The widow's son fell ill, his condition rapidly deteriorating until he stopped breathing altogether. In an instant, the joy of supernatural provision gave way to the anguish of loss. The widow, overcome with grief and perhaps a sense of bitter irony, turned to Elijah in accusation. Had he come only to remind her of her sins and cause her son's death? The prophet who had brought life through miraculous food now stood accused of bringing death. This tragic turn of events set the stage for an even greater display of God's power, one that would challenge the very boundaries between life and death. As Elijah faced this heart-rending situation, he knew that his response would be crucial. The faith of the widow, so recently kindled, now hung in the balance. How would the prophet of God answer this challenge to his ministry and to the very character of the God he served? The stage was set for a confrontation with death itself, and Elijah's next actions would reveal the true extent of divine power working through him. As the boy lay lifeless, Elijah faced his greatest test yet. The next moments would not only determine the fate of a child, but also reveal an astonishing truth about the reach of divine intervention. What unprecedented act was Elijah about to perform? The widow's anguished accusation hung in the air, her grief palpable as she blamed Elijah for her son's death. In this moment of crisis, Elijah's response would be crucial. Without hesitation, he took the boy from his mother's arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying. This act itself was significant, as it demonstrated Elijah's willingness to intimately engage with the situation rather than distance himself from the tragedy. Once in the privacy of his room, Elijah's composure gave way to raw emotion. He cried out to God in desperation, his voice filled with a mixture of anguish and faith. "O Lord my God," he pleaded, "have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" This heartfelt cry revealed the depth of Elijah's own struggle with the situation, as he grappled with understanding God's purposes in the face of such profound loss. What happened next was extraordinary. Elijah stretched himself out on the boy 3 times, a physical act that symbolized a deep, almost mystical connection between the prophet and the child. This intimate gesture of laying on hands reflected an ancient understanding of the transfer of life force or divine power. With each contact, Elijah continued to pray fervently, calling upon God to restore the child's life. The significance of Elijah's persistent prayer cannot be overstated. It demonstrated an unwavering belief in God's ability to overcome even death itself. This was not a passive acceptance of tragedy, but an active engagement with the divine, challenging the very boundaries of life and death. Elijah's actions echoed the broader biblical theme of fervent supplication, leading to miraculous outcomes. As Elijah prayed, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. A palpable sense of anticipation built with each passing moment. Would God answer this audacious request? Could life truly be restored to a body that had already grown cold? The silence was broken only by Elijah's impassioned pleas as the prophet poured out his heart before God. Then, in a moment that defied all natural laws, the impossible happened. The boy's body suddenly grew warm. His chest began to rise and fall with breath. His eyes fluttered open. Life had returned where death had reigned just moments before. Elijah, overcome with emotion and gratitude, took the living child and brought him down from the upper room to his mother. The impact of this miracle on the widow's faith was profound. Her initial blame and despair gave way to awe and belief. "Now I know that you are a man of God," she declared to Elijah, "and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." This transformation from accusation to affirmation highlighted the power of the miracle to not only restore life, but also to deepen and solidify faith. As news of this extraordinary event spread, it served as a powerful testament to God's sovereignty over life and death. Elijah's role as a conduit of divine power was firmly established, setting the stage for even greater challenges and miracles to come. The raising of the widow's son stood as a beacon of hope, demonstrating that even in the darkest moments, the power of God could bring light, life, and restoration. Fire from heaven once restored life. Now it would determine the fate of an entire nation. As Elijah stood alone against hundreds of Baal's prophets, the question hung heavy in the air. Whose God would answer with flames? The stage was set for an epic showdown on Mount Carmel. Elijah had summoned all of Israel, along with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. As the crowd gathered, anticipation filled the air. This wasn't just a test of supernatural power, it was a direct challenge to the spiritual identity of a nation that had strayed far from its roots. Elijah laid out the rules of the contest. 2 altars would be prepared, one for Baal and one for Yahweh. Each side would call upon their God to send fire to consume the sacrifice. The God who answered would be declared the true deity. The people agreed, recognizing the gravity of what was about to unfold. The prophets of Baal went first. From morning until noon, they danced around their altar, calling out to their God. Their cries grew more desperate as the hours passed, but the sky remained silent. No fire fell, no answer came. Elijah, confident in the power of Yahweh, began to mock them. "Shout louder," he taunted. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." As evening approached, it was Elijah's turn. He rebuilt the altar of Yahweh using 12 stones to represent the tribes of Israel. He dug a trench around it, arranged the wood, and prepared the bull for sacrifice. Then, in a stunning display of faith, Elijah ordered that 4 large jars of water be poured over the sacrifice and wood. He repeated this 3 times until the altar was drenched and the trench was filled with water. This act was more than mere showmanship. It was a bold declaration of trust in God's power to overcome even the most impossible odds. In a land ravaged by drought, using precious water in this way also demonstrated the completeness of Elijah's faith. With everything prepared, Elijah stepped forward to pray. His words were simple yet profound. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Fire fell from heaven, consuming not only the sacrifice but also the wood, stones, soil, and even the water in the trench. The display of divine power was so complete, so undeniable, that the people fell prostrate, crying out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" In that moment, the spiritual tide of Israel turned. The people who had wavered between Yahweh and Baal now recognized the true God. Elijah's stand on Mount Carmel had not only validated his own prophetic ministry, but had also paved the way for a national return to the worship of Yahweh. As the echoes of the people's declaration faded, a new chapter in Israel's spiritual journey was about to begin. The contest on Mount Carmel had ended, but its repercussions would reshape the nation's relationship with God for generations to come. With the prophets of Baal defeated, Elijah faced an even greater challenge. Could his faith withstand 6 failures and still bring life-giving rain to a parched land? The fire on Mount Carmel had proven God's power, but Israel still thirsted. Years of drought had ravaged the land, leaving crops withered and livestock struggling to survive. Elijah knew it was time for the final act of this divine drama. He turned to King Ahab and declared with confidence, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." Elijah then climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, determined to see God's promise fulfilled. He bowed down to the ground, his face between his knees in a posture of intense prayer. Without lifting his head, he instructed his servant, "Go and look toward the sea." The servant obeyed, scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching clouds. He returned with a disheartening report. "There is nothing there." But Elijah was undeterred. "Go back," he commanded, sending his servant to look again. And again, and again. 6 times the servant returned empty-handed, seeing only clear skies and an unbroken horizon. Yet Elijah persisted in prayer, his faith unwavering despite the lack of visible results. On the 7th attempt, everything changed. The servant's voice rang out with excitement. "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." To most, this tiny wisp might have seemed insignificant, but to Elijah, it was the harbinger of the deluge to come. Springing into action, Elijah sent word to Ahab, "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." The sky darkened rapidly as clouds gathered, driven by a rising wind. The small cloud had become the vanguard of a massive storm front, fulfilling God's promise in dramatic fashion. As Ahab raced his chariot back to Jezreel, the heavens opened, rain poured down in sheets, drenching the parched earth and filling long dry riverbeds. The sound of the downpour was like music to the ears of a people who had almost forgotten what rain felt like. Farmers and herders alike rejoiced as life-giving water soaked into the ground, promising renewed crops and pastures. Elijah, filled with the power of the Lord, hitched up his cloak and ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. This supernatural feat served as a final demonstration of God's favor upon his prophet and the fulfillment of his word. The drought had ended, but the story was far from over. As news of the day's events reached the palace, Queen Jezebel's fury ignited. The defeat of her prophets and the triumph of Yahweh threatened everything she stood for. Her reaction would set in motion a chain of events that would test Elijah's faith and resolve in ways he could never have anticipated. The rain continued to fall, washing away years of dust and despair. But in the corridors of power, a storm of a different kind was brewing, one that would drive Elijah from the heights of victory to the depths of despair, and ultimately to a divine encounter that would redefine his understanding of God's presence and power. From the mountaintop of victory to the valley of despair in mere days, Elijah's next chapter seems impossible to believe. Yet it's in this lowest moment that he'll experience a divine encounter so profound, it will forever change how we perceive God's voice. The triumph at Mount Carmel was short-lived for Elijah. When Queen Jezebel heard of the defeat of her prophets, she swore vengeance, vowing to take Elijah's life within a day. This threat shattered the prophet's confidence, and he fled for his life into the wilderness of Judah. As Elijah journeyed deeper into the barren landscape, his physical and emotional reserves dwindled. The man who had stood boldly before kings and called down fire from heaven now found himself overwhelmed by fear and doubt. After a day's travel, he collapsed beneath a solitary broom tree, his spirit as parched as the surrounding desert. In a moment of utter despair, Elijah prayed for death. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life." The contrast between this broken man and the fiery prophet of Mount Carmel was stark. It served as a poignant reminder of the human frailty that exists even in those called to great purpose. But God wasn't finished with Elijah. As the prophet slept, an angel touched him, providing food and water. This divine provision sustained Elijah for a remarkable journey, 40 days and nights of travel to Mount Horeb, also known as the Mountain of God. This period echoed other significant 40-day events in Scripture, hinting at a time of preparation and spiritual transformation. Mount Horeb held deep significance in Israelite tradition. It was here that Moses encountered God in the burning bush and received the 10 Commandments. As Elijah approached this holy ground, anticipation built. How would God reveal himself to his disheartened prophet? The answer came in a series of dramatic natural phenomena. First, a powerful wind tore through the mountains, shattering rocks. Then came an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of the mountain. This was followed by a raging fire. Each of these displays would typically be associated with divine presence in Hebrew tradition. Yet remarkably, the text tells us that God was not in any of these mighty forces. Instead, after the fire came something unexpected, a gentle whisper. In this soft voice, barely audible, Elijah encountered the presence of God. This profound moment challenged conventional expectations of how God communicates, revealing that his voice isn't always found in grand displays, but can come in quiet, intimate ways. God's message to Elijah in this gentle whisper was both a comfort and a challenge. He assured the prophet that he wasn't alone in his faithfulness and gave him new tasks to carry out. This encounter reinvigorated Elijah's spirit and refocused his mission. As Elijah descended from Mount Horeb, he carried with him not just new instructions, but a deeper understanding of God's nature. The God who could command fire from heaven and end droughts could also speak in the softest of whispers. This realization would shape the next phase of Elijah's ministry and leave an indelible mark on the spiritual understanding of generations to come. Elijah's cloak was more than just a piece of clothing. In fact, this ordinary garment was about to become a powerful symbol of divine authority and transformation. How could a prophet's mantle reshape a man's entire destiny? As Elijah journeyed from Mount Horeb, he carried new instructions from God. Among these was the task of anointing Elisha as his successor. This act would ensure the continuation of prophetic ministry in Israel and prepare the next generation of spiritual leadership. Elijah's search for Elisha led him to a field where 12 pairs of oxen were plowing. There, he found Elisha himself guiding the 12th pair. The scene was one of ordinary agricultural life. yet it was about to become the setting for an extraordinary calling. Without a word, Elijah approached Elisha and threw his cloak over the young man's shoulders. This simple act carried profound significance in the cultural and spiritual context of ancient Israel. The prophet's cloak symbolized his authority and divine commission. By placing it on Elisha, Elijah was effectively passing on his role and inviting Elisha into a new life of prophetic service. The tension of the moment was palpable. Would Elisha understand the significance of this gesture? More importantly, would he accept the call and leave behind the life he knew? The decision before Elisha was monumental, requiring him to abandon his livelihood and family to follow Elijah into an uncertain future. Elisha's response revealed both his understanding and his respect for family ties. He asked Elijah for permission to say goodbye to his parents before following him. This request demonstrated Elisha's awareness of the life-changing nature of Elijah's call, while also honoring the cultural importance of familial bonds. Elijah's reply was cryptic. "Go back. What have I done to you?" This response seems to have been a test of Elisha's resolve, challenging him to fully grasp the weight of the calling placed upon him. It was an invitation for Elisha to consider carefully the path that lay before him. Elisha's next actions spoke volumes about his commitment. He returned to his oxen, slaughtered them, and used the wooden plow to cook the meat, providing a feast for the people. This act symbolized Elisha's complete break with his former life. By destroying his means of livelihood, he demonstrated his wholehearted embrace of the prophetic calling. The transformation of Elisha from farmer to prophet in training had begun. As he shared the meat with his community, it marked both an ending and a beginning. Elisha was saying farewell to his old life, while also celebrating the new journey he was about to undertake. With the feast concluded, Elisha set out to follow Elijah. The older prophet would now take on the role of mentor, guiding Elisha in the ways of prophetic ministry. This relationship would be crucial in preparing Elisha for the challenges and responsibilities that lay ahead. As Elijah and Elisha journeyed together, a new chapter in Israel's spiritual history was unfolding. The mantle of prophecy was being passed to a new generation, ensuring that God's voice would continue to be heard in the land. The story of these two prophets was far from over, and their partnership would shape the course of events in ways they could not yet imagine. While Elijah was mentoring his successor, King Ahab was about to make a fateful decision that would shake the very foundations of his reign. How could a simple plot of land lead to murder, divine judgment, and an unprecedented display of royal humility? The tale of Naboth's vineyard exposes the true cost of unchecked power. King Ahab had set his sights on a vineyard adjacent to his palace in Jezreel. This land belonged to Naboth, a man who valued his ancestral inheritance above royal desires. When Ahab approached Naboth to purchase the vineyard or trade it for a better one, Naboth firmly refused. His response, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors," was rooted in the ancient Israelite laws that viewed land as a sacred trust from God, not to be permanently sold. Ahab's reaction to this refusal revealed his true character. He returned to his palace sulking and refused to eat, behaving like a petulant child denied a toy. Enter Queen Jezebel, whose solution to her husband's disappointment would have far-reaching consequences. She devised a sinister plan to acquire Naboth's vineyard through deceit and murder. Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed with his seal, to the elders and nobles of Naboth's city. She instructed them to proclaim a day of fasting and seat Naboth in a prominent place. Then, they were to bring in two scoundrels to falsely accuse Naboth of cursing both God and the king. The punishment for such a crime was death by stoning. The plan unfolded exactly as Jezebel had orchestrated. Naboth was falsely accused, convicted without a fair trial, and stoned to death outside the city. With Naboth eliminated, Jezebel triumphantly told Ahab to take possession of the coveted vineyard. However, this act of injustice did not go unnoticed by God. He sent Elijah to confront Ahab as the king went to claim his ill-gotten prize. Elijah's words to Ahab were sharp and unequivocal. "This is what the Lord says. Have you not murdered a man and seized his property? In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood, yes, yours." This prophecy against Ahab's house was more than just a punishment for one man's death. It represented God's judgment on the corruption and injustice that had taken root in Israel under Ahab and Jezebel's rule. Elijah foretold the complete destruction of Ahab's line, declaring that dogs would devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel, and that Ahab's male descendants would meet violent ends. The weight of Elijah's words struck Ahab to his core. In a surprising turn of events, the king who had so callously orchestrated an innocent man's death now humbled himself before God. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted. This display of repentance, however brief, moved God to adjust his judgment. Speaking to Elijah, God said, "Have you noticed how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself, I will not bring this disaster in his day, but I will bring it on his house in the days of his son." This incident marked a turning point in Ahab's reign and in Elijah's ministry. As the prophet prepared to confront what would be his final challenges, the stage was set for a dramatic conclusion to his earthly mission. The story of Naboth's vineyard served as a powerful reminder of the consequences of abusing power and the potential for divine mercy, even in the face of grave injustice. As King Ahab's demise, a new threat to God's authority emerged. King Ahaziah lay bedridden after a severe fall, and in his desperation, he made a choice that would ignite a celestial showdown and seal his own fate. Rather than seeking guidance from the God of Israel, Ahaziah sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. This decision revealed the depth of Israel's spiritual decline under his rule, as even in times of crisis, the king turned to pagan deities for answers. It was a blatant rejection of Yahweh's authority and a continuation of the idolatrous practices established by his father, Ahab. But God was not silent in the face of this affront. He sent Elijah to intercept the king's messengers before they could reach Ekron. The prophet's sudden appearance on the road must have startled the envoys. With unwavering conviction, Elijah delivered a scathing message. "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub? Therefore, this is what the Lord says. You will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die." When the messengers returned and reported this encounter to Ahaziah, the king's reaction was one of anger and defiance. Instead of heeding the divine warning, he demanded to know more about the man who had dared to challenge his authority. Upon learning it was Elijah, Ahaziah's response was swift and hostile. He dispatched a captain with 50 soldiers to arrest the prophet, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation. As the first group of soldiers approached Elijah, who was sitting on top of a hill, the captain called out, "Man of God, the king says, 'Come down.'" Elijah's response was both bold and terrifying. He answered, "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Immediately fire fell from the sky, incinerating the entire group. Undeterred, Ahaziah sent a second captain with another 50 men. This group met the same fate as the first, consumed by heavenly fire at Elijah's word. These displays of divine power served as a potent reminder of God's authority and the consequences of opposing his will. They also echoed the fire that fell on Mount Carmel, reinforcing Elijah's role as God's chosen prophet. As tension mounted, Ahaziah dispatched a third captain with his 50 men. This time, however, the approach was markedly different. The captain, having witnessed the fate of his predecessors, came to Elijah with humility and respect. He fell on his knees before the prophet and begged for mercy, acknowledging the value of their lives in God's sight. This shift in attitude proved crucial. God instructed Elijah to go with this captain and confront Ahaziah in person, assuring the prophet's safety. The scene was set for a final, face-to-face encounter between the king who had turned to false gods and the prophet who spoke for the true God of Israel. As Elijah prepared to deliver God's judgment to Ahaziah, there was a sense that this confrontation marked the culmination of his prophetic mission. The stage was set for Elijah's final acts on earth as his time of departure drew near. The prophet who had challenged kings, called down fire from heaven, and stood firm against idolatry was about to face his greatest transition yet, one that would defy the very laws of nature and secure his place in history. As Elijah's earthly mission neared its end, an extraordinary journey began. What if I told you that his final steps would retrace the very path of Israel's spiritual heritage, each location holding a key to understanding the prophet's legacy? The story that unfolds is not just about one man's departure, but about the passing of a divine mantle that would shape the future of God's people. Elijah knew his time on earth was drawing to a close. With this awareness, he set out on a pilgrimage that would take him from Gilgal to Bethel, then to Jericho, and finally to the Jordan River. At each stop, he attempted to leave his faithful disciple, Elisha, behind. "Stay here," Elijah would say, "for the Lord has sent me to Bethel," and later to Jericho and the Jordan. But Elisha remained steadfast, refusing to be separated from his mentor. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live," Elisha vowed, "I will not leave you." Their journey took them through locations steeped in Israel's spiritual history. Gilgal, the first campsite after crossing into the Promised Land, represented new beginnings and God's covenant. Bethel, meaning house of God, was associated with Jacob's divine encounter and had long been a center of worship. Jericho, with its fallen walls, stood as a testament to God's power in conquering the land. At each of these places, groups known as the Sons of the Prophets approached Elisha with a startling message. "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Their warnings served to highlight the gravity of the moment and the respect they held for Elijah's ministry. Elisha's response was always the same: "Yes, I know, but do not speak of it." His words revealed both his awareness of the impending separation and his emotional struggle with it. As Elijah and Elisha approached the Jordan River, the anticipation grew. 50 of the sons of the prophets followed at a distance, watching to see what would unfold. Elijah took off his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water. In a miraculous display reminiscent of the Israelites' first crossing into the Promised Land, the river parted, allowing the two prophets to cross on dry ground. This act of parting the waters symbolized more than just a physical crossing. It represented the transition of prophetic authority and the continuity of God's work through his chosen servants. As Elijah and Elisha stood on the other side of the Jordan, they were poised on the threshold of a momentous event that would redefine the nature of prophetic succession in Israel. With each step of this final journey, the bond between Elijah and Elisha deepened, and the stage was set for Elisha's ultimate request. The mantle of prophecy was about to be passed, not through a formal ceremony, but through an act of faith and divine intervention that would leave an indelible mark on Israel's spiritual landscape. As the moment of separation drew near, Elisha made a bold request that would test the limits of prophetic succession. What could he possibly ask for that would make even the great Elijah pause? The answer would set the stage for one of the most dramatic exits in biblical history. Elisha, knowing his mentor's time on earth was ending, asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. This request was deeply significant, echoing the inheritance rights of a firstborn son in ancient Israelite culture. By asking for a double portion, Elisha wasn't seeking twice Elijah's power, but rather the full rights and responsibilities of a spiritual successor. He was essentially asking to be recognized as Elijah's true heir in the prophetic ministry. Elijah's response revealed the weight of this request. "You have asked a difficult thing," he told Elisha. The transfer of prophetic authority wasn't something Elijah could simply grant on his own. It required divine approval and intervention. Elijah set a condition. If Elisha saw him as he was taken away, the request would be granted. This moment of tension heightened the anticipation of what was to come. As they continued walking and talking, the air suddenly crackled with otherworldly energy. Without warning, a chariot of fire appeared, drawn by horses of fire. This extraordinary sight was more than just a dramatic special effect. In ancient Near Eastern culture, chariots symbolized divine power and judgment. The fiery nature of this chariot emphasized its supernatural origin and the direct involvement of God in this moment. Before Elisha could fully process what he was seeing, a whirlwind enveloped Elijah. In a breathtaking display of divine power, the prophet was lifted into the sky, ascending towards heaven. This wasn't a quiet, gentle departure, but a dramatic demonstration of God's approval of Elijah's life and ministry. As Elijah disappeared from view, his cloak fell to the ground, a physical symbol of the prophetic mantle being passed on. Elisha's reaction was both emotional and symbolic. He tore his own clothes in two, a traditional expression of mourning that marked the end of his apprenticeship. But this act of grief quickly gave way to a powerful moment of transition. Elisha picked up Elijah's fallen cloak, accepting the weight of responsibility and authority it represented. This moment of Elijah's ascension and Elisha's acceptance of his cloak marked a pivotal transition in Israel's prophetic tradition. It confirmed that God's work would continue through a new generation, ensuring an ongoing prophetic voice to guide and challenge the nation. As Elisha stood alone, holding Elijah's cloak, he faced the daunting task of carrying forward his mentor's legacy while forging his own path as God's chosen prophet. The impact of Elijah's dramatic departure would resonate through generations, shaping how future believers understood God's power and the continuity of his work through chosen servants. As Elisha prepared to return across the Jordan, he carried not just a physical cloak, but the weighty responsibility of continuing Elijah's mission in a world that desperately needed to hear God's voice. Elisha stood at the edge of the Jordan River, Elijah's cloak clutched tightly in his hands. The weight of his mentor's legacy pressed upon him as he faced his first test as the new prophet of Israel. With a mixture of faith and trepidation, Elisha struck the water with the cloak, echoing Elijah's actions from mere hours before. "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he called out, his voice carrying across the river. For a moment nothing happened. The water continued to flow, indifferent to Elisha's plea. But then, as if responding to an unseen command, the river began to part. The waters separated, creating a dry path just as they had for Elijah. Elisha crossed over, his steps firm on the exposed riverbed, a tangible confirmation of God's continued presence and power working through him. On the other side, the sons of the prophets watched in awe. These men, who had followed Elijah and witnessed his departure, now saw undeniable proof that Elisha had indeed received the prophetic mantle. They bowed to the ground before him, acknowledging, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." Their recognition marked a crucial moment in the transition of prophetic authority. Elisha's first miracles further cemented his role as Elijah's successor. In Jericho, he encountered a problem that had plagued the city for generations. Its water was bad, causing death and crop failure. With a simple act of throwing salt into the spring, Elisha purified the water, bringing life and fertility back to the land. This act of healing and restoration showcased a compassionate dimension to his prophetic ministry, addressing the practical needs of the people. However, Elisha's early days as a prophet weren't without challenges. As he traveled to Bethel, a group of youths mocked him, calling out, "Go on up, you bald head!" Their taunts weren't just personal insults, but a challenge to his authority as God's representative. Elisha's response was severe. He cursed them in the name of the Lord, resulting in 2 bears emerging from the woods and mauling 42 of the youths. This incident, while harsh to modern sensibilities, demonstrated the seriousness with which God viewed disrespect towards his chosen prophet. These early acts set the stage for Elisha's future ministry. He had shown his ability to perform miracles like Elijah, but also displayed a unique approach to his role. Where Elijah had often worked alone, confronting kings and calling down fire from heaven, Elisha's miracles tended to focus more on the needs of ordinary people, providing food, healing the sick, and offering guidance to those in need. As word of Elisha's deeds spread throughout Israel, anticipation grew for what his ministry would bring. The people who had seen the power of God work through Elijah now looked to Elisha with a mixture of hope and expectation. Would he continue to challenge the corrupt rulers of Israel? How would he confront the persistent problem of idolatry in the land? Elisha's confirmation as Elijah's successor marked not just a personal transition, but a new chapter in Israel's spiritual history. The mantle had been passed, and with it, the responsibility to speak God's truth to a nation that often struggled to listen. As Elisha embarked on his prophetic journey, the legacy of Elijah lived on, shaping the future of Israel in ways that would resonate for generations to come. Elijah's life was marked by unwavering faith and bold actions that challenged the spiritual status quo of ancient Israel. From his confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel to his miraculous ascension in a chariot of fire, Elijah's story is filled with powerful moments that demonstrate God's sovereignty and the importance of obedience. The lessons from Elijah's life continue to resonate in both Jewish and Christian traditions. His courage in standing against idolatry, his persistence in prayer, and his mentorship of Elisha all serve as enduring examples of faithful service. Even in moments of doubt and despair, such as his flight from Jezebel, Elijah's story shows how God sustains and renews those who trust in him. Elijah's legacy extends beyond his earthly life, with his prophesied return before the great and dreadful day of the Lord holding significant eschatological importance. His life stands as a testament to the power of faith and obedience in the face of adversity, inspiring believers to stand firm in their convictions and trust in God's provision, even when circumstances seem insurmountable.